I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Ted Labun from Syngenta, Canada. He's the seed care technical lead for Western Canada. We spoke, some members of our group spoke with Ted on the phone late last year, and he has some really interesting insights into what they're doing about wireworm control in Western Canada, as well as how Syngenta sees wireworm and possible control of wireworm. So firstly, thanks very much to Ted for being here today, and thank you very much to Syngenta Canada for making Ted available and for covering his costs to be here to speak to us today. So without further ado, Ted.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I'll just try and talk like this so you can all hear me. It's a real miracle I'm actually here, because number one, I'm not a potato person. And my colleagues in Calgary says, why are you going to Prince Edward Island? It was very strange for them, but then we started talking about wireworms. It all started to come together. So it took about a month of emails, but I finally got my plane ticket so I could come out here. If we take a look at wireworms, I'd like to address a couple of questions. Why is the prairies not having a big problem with wireworms? And I'll start off with my presentation by giving you a short introduction about agriculture in the prairies and some of the changes that have happened in terms of how that has impacted our wireworm issues. But the second point on my agenda, if you look at the screen, is the impact on crop. And I will definitely be showing you some pictures of things that are happening in fields in the prairie provinces. But it really doesn't do justice. I'm finding that it's a very emotional insect pest in the prairies. And if I was in a meeting like this one here, I would not ask the question, how many of you have wireworms? Because I would dare say that most of them would not put their hand up. And the reason for that is it's just such an emotional disease that they can not always control. I've got a couple of growers that I'm working with right now where they can't grow wheat, they can't grow lentils, they're struggling with growing canola, and a couple of these growers are getting close to retirement now, and the one family particularly has 2 daughters that they've been married and they're moved off the farm and they're living in Calgary and Lethbridge and have no intentions to come to the farm. So he's saying, Ted, what am I going to do in 5 years? I want to sell the farm. So how do I sell a farm where I can't grow a lot of these crops? So a lot of them, it's a very emotional disease. So when you hear about, oh, it's not a problem, it's a lot of times the growers are not that willing to share until there's a solution. Once you have a solution and you can manage the problem, it's not a big deal anymore. Everyone can say what issues they have on their farm and manage it. So that's one of the things about wireworms in the prairies. When we talk about solutions, I'll talk a little bit about solutions. And it's so important to hear Bob's talk and what you folks here are doing in terms of the research. Until you understand the biology and the research behind the wireworms, it's very difficult to develop a solution strategy. So even though it seems like solutions are slowly coming and are taking a long time, it really is the research that builds the building blocks to developing a strategy, because this insect pest, as Bob said, is all underground. So it's very unusual, different than other pests where you can take a sweep net and you can sweep for lygus bugs or seed pod weevil or grasshoppers, and you can visually see what you're doing. With wireworms, it's a very challenging insect. I had a laugh when Bob said he'd never go into research. I was saying, as an employee of Syngenta, I was hoping someone else would do wireworms, but I somehow got stuck with it. And so as a result of that, it can be very frustrating as you're trying to develop solutions for the problem. So that's sort of my introduction. And then I'd like to tell a little bit about management strategies that we're proposing for our growers in the prairies for 2014. And then I'll just wrap up with a summary and what we hope to see with the future. I'm hoping that in 5 years there will only be 4 people in this room if I come back, because everyone solved their problems. So that's sort of my little introduction as to what I'd like to share with you this afternoon. So I thought I'd give you a little introduction to the prairies. You've seen a few maps already on Western Canada or the prairie provinces. And if you take a look at that map, I like this one particularly because it also breaks it down by soil zone or soil type. So we have actually 3 distinct soil types in the prairies. And I'm going to make a lot of generalities because there's always differences within that geography. But if you take a look at that map, you see the black soil zone. So if you look at towns that you're maybe familiar, like Winnipeg, Manitoba, or most of Manitoba, it's in the black soil zone. If you move towards Saskatchewan, you get into that Yorkton area, Melfort area, that's the black soil zone. Saskatoon is just outside the black soil zone, and then you go to Edmonton and south to Calgary. That is traditionally also where most of our rainfall occurs. So especially in Manitoba, we can grow a lot of different crops. We've got good heat units. So if I take a look at the prairies, the one crop that you can grow across all the soil zones is cereals. So that's a very important crop for us. In the black soil zone, traditionally, that's where canola was introduced 30 years ago, and it's exploded in terms of a crop. Most of our pulses are grown in that southern part, the brown soil zone. So southern Saskatchewan is our huge pulse area. If you look at where our potatoes are growing, they're grown in southern Manitoba. And if you take a look at where the potatoes are growing in Alberta, it's in that irrigation district. We have 1 million acres of irrigation in southern Alberta, and potatoes is a big part of that rotation. So if we take a look at the total acres in Western Canada, we have approximately 65 million acres that are farmed in the prairie provinces. And if you take a look at the crops that we grow, you'll see that in cereals, 50% of our acres is cereals. So it's very much like PEI. Your main crop is potatoes when I see your survey. I know there's other crops growing here, but cereals for us is extremely important. And it's important for a number of reasons. It's an important rotational crop with our specialty crops because we have a lot of issues potentially with airborne diseases, particularly sclerotinia or white mold. You look at our canola, soybeans, acres, you need that cereal crop to manage some of the other diseases. So we have to have cereals. And the nice thing about cereals is you can grow it anywhere. So if I take a look at our spring wheat acres, which is 25% of our acres, it's grown pretty much everywhere across the prairies. Where we grow our best durum is in the drier areas. So it's in southern Saskatchewan. So if I look at the percentages of cereal crops, spring wheats are number one. Barley is certainly important, especially in Alberta, where we have a significant beef industry. Barley is very important for us, and that's where most of our barley is grown. And if you take a look at those rotations, it has a huge impact on our rotations. So if you think about it, canola, which is 30% of our acres, and you take wheat, which is 50% of our acres, what do you think the rotation is in most geographies in Western Canada? It's a wheat, canola rotation. And the other thing is we don't use tillage anymore to prepare our seed beds anymore, and we've really moved away from pre-emergent herbicides. If you go back 30 years ago, there was a lot of pre-emergent herbicides used, and then the introduction of all the post-emergent herbicides has really eliminated that need for a lot of tillage. So we direct seed most of our fields. There's very little tillage that takes place. And if you think about it from a wireworm perspective, you got a wheat, canola rotation. Well, in that canola, you also have volunteer wheat. So when you really think about it, you don't have 50% of your acres in wheat. When you think about wireworms, really, you probably got more like 80% of your acres. Because if you look at Bob's story there, when the clicks come out in the spring, they're very attracted to cereal crops. So not only in your canola rotation are you going to have click beetles laying eggs, but you're also going to have it or not in your cereal crop that you plant, but you're also going to see it in your canola crop. Another important rotation that really is conducive for wireworms, in the southern part of Saskatchewan, we grow a lot of durum, and in that southern part, we also have a lot of lentils. So it's a wheat, lentil rotation. And our experience is that they like both crops, is very important. So that's just sort of a little background. I thought it was important to set the stage as to what are our key crops. The myth that we don't have wireworms, or it's not a problem in the West, that is certainly not true. And if you talk to the growers face-to-face at the kitchen table, it's not just a topic. It's very emotional. Of course, I get emotional too, because the one grower, his wife sat with us for 6 hours. When I make a grower call, you never see the spouse at those kitchen table meetings, but her potatoes were affected in her garden. So this was getting real personal. Not only was it the field, but it was also her garden. So she wanted to learn as much as she could about wireworms. So we did talk a lot about species today already, and the importance of species. And our species are definitely different than yours. We have the destructor. And it's in the literature, if you look at some of the old publications that the provincial governments used to put it, they refer to it as the prairie grain wireworm. And you'll always see a picture of that big, large larvae that Bob showed there. It is huge, and it can take down a lot of crops. That's the problem, when a grower phones me and says, well, I got wireworms in my bait ball, I always ask the question, is it a big one or is it a small one? And if he doesn't have a small one, a big one, he doesn't know how big is big and how small is small. But it's hard to predict, okay, so if I got 10 wireworms in my trap, how significant it is that? Well, if it's the prairie grain wireworm or the destructor, it's very significant. If it's the Hypnotes by color, you'll still see damage. But if you have hundreds and hundreds of the Hypnotes, we've also seen it doing significant damage in cereal crops and pulses. So it's, that whole question about species is important and what potential risk it has to the crop. So let's talk a little bit about impact on crops. And again, pictures don't really show the story of what the growers are feeling in Western Canada or on the prairie provinces. I showed this one specifically because this was one that's important for our southern potato growers, because this cornfield is right in the heart of our potato country. So it's under irrigation. This particular grower has a big feedlot operator. He doesn't have potatoes in his rotation at all. In our part of the world down in southern Alberta, a lot of the potato growers will rent as well as own their own land so they can keep their rotations. But this is in the heart of our potato country, so I thought it would be relevant to this meeting. But this field here has been in corn for 11 years when I went to see the field. And the impact that we were seeing that day was in 2011. It didn't start till about 5 years ago. And then he started to see little patches in his cornfield where he was starting to miss plants and the corn was stunted and so on. So we did see damage, but it didn't really happen till the last 2 years where he was really getting concerned. And that's an important point to make, is that when you look at the life cycle of that particular insect, it's a long life cycle. And if you have a wreck, or my experience is if you've had a wreck, that didn't happen 1 year ago, that didn't happen 2 years ago, it's probably started 15 or even 20 years ago in some cases, till it built to the point where you start to see issues where growers are starting to get really concerned. And in this particular field, what I noticed too was not only the thinning of the plant stand, but there was also a significant stunting. So even the plants that did survive, when I dug them up, I would find the wireworms right in the stalk, which was very unusual for me, because usually I find them under the roots below the soil surface, but for some reason, because it's irrigated, maybe it stays cool, that they were right in the stalk of the corn. And of course, the corn plants were very short, stunted. So it's not only just the plant stand, but it's also the impact it has on the potential. And of course, this guy is a silage farmer, so he needs the silage. But I mean, it would also affect the grain part of the production as well. So if you remember, I said canola was an important crop for us. The one thing I've found about canola is that if you have volunteer wheat in your canola crop, it's sort of like dessert versus vegetables. They seem to go after the wheat first. And I've seen fields of canola that were saved because there was a lot of volunteer wheat in the field, and they just fed on the volunteer wheat. The volunteer wheat was, because we don't do tillage as well prior to planting, the wheat is ready, usually germinate, especially if you don't get to the field right away and plant your canola. So they're really very actively feeding on a CO2 source and very happy. And once they've gone through that feeding cycle, they go down and you plant your canola, and it seems like the canola can survive. But in this particular field, this grower phoned me up and said, I got some thinning in my fields, and I think it might be wireworms. And so if you take a look at that picture on the top right there, if you're a canola grower, you would know right away that the number of plants per square foot there is very low. We see it about 5 pounds an acre of canola seed, and we target 10 to 15 plants per square foot. On this particular field, when I walked into it, I could see right away he probably only established 5 plants per square foot. And the impact that that has on canola, it will cause the canola to keep flowering. And when you look at our maturity days, we need a variety that will mature within 110 days, otherwise you get green seed and you get reduction in oil content and so on. So having that plant stand is very important. But one thing that became very clear was there was these patches in the field where there was no canola. And when I put my bait ball out there, trap out there, it was very easy to catch the wireworms. And in this case, there was no other source of CO2, so I do know now that they do feed on canola if that's the only food source they have. And then I confirmed that with the field next to it. So the bottom picture there on the you see that canola field and you see that stand there. There was definitely wireworms feeding on that, and that's why we're seeing a reduction in the stand in that particular field. And you can see what the implications of that is very important. The other thing I just want to share, if your plant stand is too thin and you get a good wind and you can't anchor that plant stand with a good swath, it'll blow all over the field. So the implications of that little bit of damage so early in the season has ramifications right through to harvest time. So when people say to me, well, what's the impact of wireworms on canola? It's a longer story than just what I've talked to you here today about. It's much more important than that. So let's talk about lentils. Lentils is an important crop for Saskatchewan. That's where all our durum is as well. And it's a durum wheat, or a durum lentil, particularly in that Moose Jaw area, Regina, Swift Current. Maybe you're familiar with some of those names, Kindredsley. And so we do grow a lot of spring wheat and lentil rotation in there, and they do like lentils. There's no question about it. This was prior to when we first got registration of our first insecticide on lentils, but you can see the patchiness in there. I mean, it's quite devastated. The one thing about lentils too is that it's not a very competitive crop. It's a very short crop. It only grows about 6 inches, 7 inches off the ground. And it's very important in pulses to keep a good canopy there for weed control. And it can be a weed nightmare in lentils if your stand is too thin. And if wireworms really thin it out, it's not just the yield that you're concerned about, it's other issues too when it comes to management practices. We don't have a really good herbicides in pulse crops, so crop competition is an important part of our strategy. The picture on the other one there was I took in 2013 when I was in Swift Current, and we were just talking to this one grower, and he says, you got to come look at my lentil field. And I showed this picture here because I wanted to show you how we plant lentils. And if you look at it, you can see the wheat stubble there. But you know where I saw the gaps in the lentils, there was also gaps in the stubble. You could see where the wireworms had taken out or thinned out the wheat crop prior to that. So you can learn a lot about walking fields just by looking at what's going on. And because we don't do a lot of tillage, it's really easy to see it. If you do a lot of plowing, I don't know where I'd put the trowel. But in this case, you know, we can really see the damage the following spring when we look at what it does. The other picture there, I just put down, we did a collaboration work with Wim van Herk, which works with Bob and you can just see the impact of seed treatments have on wireworm control in lentils. It's very obvious there. You can see the untreated. But I threw the other picture beside it because it's also a lentil crop in one of our trials in Saskatchewan. In that particular trial, the wireworms didn't actually start feeding till the crop was well established. And then it nailed them. So, you know, when it comes to the weather conditions can play a key role. And, you know, as we understand more about if it turns really dry after planting and they move back down, you can actually get a successful crop going, and then you get a good rain, and then they come back up and they can still do a significant amount of damage. Now, in the case of lentils, it can't tolerate a lot of feeding later in the season, where a cereal crop, you may affect some of the tillers, but, you know, it won't have a big devastating effect as we do in lentils. So crop specific is also important when we look at the impact that wireworms can have on different crops. So let's talk about the big one, the cereal crop. You know, the fields that I've been walking over the last 5 years, it always starts in patches. You know, most growers will tell me, you know, they planted this year and they thought they had a plug drill because there was a gap in their row and they saw, you know, 6 or 7 plants that didn't come up or weren't there. Now, one thing I've learned about wireworms, they're kind of lazy. They'll go where it's easiest. They'll go down a row. They won't transverse across to another row. Why would you do that? Your cultivator shank has now put a nice little easy path with tunnels and everything. So why would I go across the row? Why not just go down the row? And that's how it usually starts. And then it takes another 5 years, and then you see a bigger patch. Another 5 years, it takes a bigger, it just grows and grows and grows. So the field I want to show you at the bottom there, the left is bare ground. Unfortunately, all my pictures look the same because they're all different farms, but we don't have trees in a lot of these areas, so it all looks the same. I was telling my colleagues here, I just love Prince Edward Island. You got trees here, you got a building here. If I took a picture here, I'd know exactly where it was. So when I take a picture, I got to label it right away because otherwise I forget where I took that picture. But that one here was easy for me to remember. He planted that wheat field on May the 3rd, and on May 29th, it was completely gone. And he said it came up really nice. He planted early. And those soil temperatures, Bob, were around 5 degrees. I mean, that's when we start planting. We have a lot of residue on the soil, so its temperatures stay cool. But then they came up, and then they took out his whole crop. And when I was there on May 29th, I started scraping across the soil, and the picture on your right was what we were finding in terms of what the wireworms had done. They had just completely chewed the whole thing. And on this particular field, we had 2 species, Limonius californicus and the destructor species. So we had 2. Both can be very devastating, and they just chewed that crop right off. So we had a beautiful crop of wheat there. The neighbors were wondering what happened, of course. Of course, he wasn't too willing to share with them what really happened. Fortunately, he had crop insurance, but how many years can he keep claiming crop insurance, right? So this is a real concern for us in cereals as well. Okay, so let's move into seed treatments. I'm still good for time, eh? Okay. So let's take a look at seed treatments. I mean, it's obvious the first line of attack. I went to sales from 2000 to 2005. I think every person should be in sales for at least 5 years because it really helps you understand growers. And sales is a tough job, but there's a lot of rewards to sales. So we got registration of our product in 2005, and there was a grower in Milk River who I know it's 2 miles from the Montana border, and he was saying he's got wireworm issues. So when as a salesperson you can go and you can help a grower solve his problem, there's nothing more satisfying than going home and knowing that you've done something for that particular grower. And this particular field here I was so excited about because this was my first sale. This is the first seed treatment that went in Alberta where I was a part of. I was part of that whole exploration. It was very exciting for me. And I must admit, I left the field and I thought I had killed every wireworm in that field. And the grower was convinced that he had killed every wireworm in that field. But when we fast forward, it's not true. We certainly do have some impact on wireworms. There's no question that in some of our studies we've seen 10% kill, but I'm not too sure whether it's because they rise to the top when they were exposed and the environmental conditions killed them or what. But there is some impact. But again, they're not long residual. They're not persistent. So when the clicks come in, like Bob was saying, they're not having an impact on the click population. You got to remember too, these clicks are running around and they're laying their eggs. And I'm convinced now that when you look at those neonates when they first hatch, they're very vulnerable to mortality. But with our conditions now, that soil surface stays nice and moist now, which has been very important for us. Conservation tillage has saved the prairies, there's no question. But it does create other issues. Now, we could talk about diseases as well and how that's impacted it. But in the case of wireworms, I believe those neonates, the survival is much better. And so that's just sort of speeding up this whole process of what wireworms are doing in the prairies. But seed treatments is certainly an option, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we talk about finding new solutions. We've had a real change of thought in terms of how to manage these wireworms. Until Dr. Vernon did all this work on the behavior of insecticides and wireworm interaction, we really didn't understand what was going. If you take a look at some of the research after the 50s and 60s, and you go into the 90s, and you read those research reports, what you'll find in the literature is that the scientist or the researcher that did the work measured plant count stand and yield. and did their statistical analysis on that. But never really paid attention to what we were doing with the populations. And with the change of chemistries and everything else that we're doing, if we don't manage the population, that's when the problems start to come. And if I look at some of our growers, I would say we're going to be very successful in using our current technology to give us those good plant stands. But if I look 10 years or 15 years down the road, we're going to start to see issues because the populations are just getting too high. And I wanted to show you this field here because when we were looking at doing some research, I went to Agassiz and I met with Dr. Byrne. I said, so how do I do these trials if I want to do mortality? I don't want to just do a stand count. Well, first of all, you have to get a good site. And if I take a look at this site, this field here, this grower is 300 acres. This one field of wheat the previous year. And he said, I think I got wireworm problems. And if you took a look at that, this is what the spring looked like when I went to visit him. And when we drove the truck across the field, we could see patches like this all over the place. Not just half acre, not just 2 acre, it was like 10 acres where there's just completely brown or black patches there. So I figured, okay, well, this has got to be a good place for a wireworm trial. Because what we wanted to do, we wanted to not only look at in-season stand establishment, but we also wanted to look at what impact it has on the population itself. And that's important to understand because if you just base it on in-season stand establishment, you'll get treatments that we'll say don't work. But you have no idea what you're doing under the ground. If you're killing them, you've already got control. And the implications of that is really, and I want to make sure that clearly, we're not out to kill everything. That's not the strategy for wireworm population management. I think anybody that wants to think they want to kill it the first year every wireworm is physically impossible, and we don't even want to do that. But if we could reduce the populations by 70% or 60%, it's a good strategy to start to eliminate that larvae population and the impact it will have on stand and in quality. So the other thing I learned from Dr. Verne, he says, don't touch the soil. Well, that eliminates a lot of seedbed preparation. It eliminates the use of some equipment. So that meant I had to plant this by hand. So Bob's right when he says, don't get into wireworm research because it's a lot of work. But I felt it was worthwhile because if Dr. Vernon talked about the neonates and how sensitive they are. Well, we didn't want to do any disturbance, so we planted these by hand. So I thought I would start with corn because that was something I could plant by hand quite easily. There was not a lot of labor, so whenever the hard work comes, you see all those students are gone, right? So they're all gone for lunch. But it was worthwhile because I spent the whole day planting this trial. And after I dug the hole, so I did 4 rows per plot. It was 2 by 6 meters, replicated 4 times. And after I dug the holes and put my string out, I came back and it was amazing. 80% of those holes, a wireworm started poking through the soil. And I was in heaven because this was exactly what we needed. We needed a site where I knew that there would be an even distribution of wireworms across the whole field because if you don't have a nice uniform population of wireworms, it's very difficult to show treatment effects, right? To get statistical analysis and everything else. So planting by hand, I really knew that I had a very good population of wireworms. So what was the end result? At the end, I was more concerned. I was planting, how am I going to harvest all this corn? Because I didn't have a harvester. And the grower is not a corn grower. But I only had 1 corn plant left. The wireworms took care of all my harvest issues and just wiped out the whole plot. And I had nothing but wild oats. And I sprayed 3 times with glyphosate because it was also a glyphosate-tolerant variety. And it was just almost impossible to keep the wild oats. But what was really interesting from this study was that when you look at crop, like why aren't they feeding on these wild oats? I mean, that's the #1 grass weed in Western Canada is wild oats. And it kind of got us into thinking, well, what about tame oats? So I'll share a little bit too what our experiences with some rotations. So sometimes what looks like a wreck can also give you some answers. The other thing too is I didn't care about the corn, actually. What I cared about was what was going on underneath. And what we did is when we looked at the cereal plots, right, Bob has already shown some pictures here, Some of these treatments, even though there's no crop there, are very exciting treatments. Because when we went the next year to see what impact it had on populations, we saw some treatments actually really knock down the populations. So we're onto something I think that's going to be, as a long-term success, will be some of these seed treatments are very effective on knocking down the populations. So to do a wireworm, what I'm saying is that sometimes it takes 2-3 years to really find the answers you're looking for. And so that last picture there is Dr. Wim van Herk came out, and we were able to put out these bait balls for each of these plots, and we were able to document what the mortality was with the different seed treatments as they're feeding on the cereal crop. So we learned some exciting things. We got some new strategies now. So I guess the bottom line, what I'm saying is sometimes it's not what you see above ground that's important. It's really what's happening underneath the ground to really help us understand what is a good management strategy moving forward. So for 2014, unfortunately we don't have a silver bullet. I think it was someone who said a silver bullet. No, we don't have a silver bullet. So we're going to start looking at implementation of many things to help us. One of the biggest things is just scouting. I mean, how do you scout wireworms? Well, one thing about Superstore and Safeway and Co-op, they all have oatmeal. It's cheap. You have to buy a little bit of honey, and you just watch the Super Bowl game, and you make bait balls. And then you put them in your freezer. So my wife doesn't like it, but I got half the freezer's bait balls. As long as I don't bring the worms home, she's okay with that. And we put out these bait ball traps out in the field, and just to get an idea. Now, the one thing about bait balls, it doesn't tell you what the economic losses are going to be in that field. And Dr. Vernon's already referenced why that's the case. They may not come feeding. Soil temperature may be different if you have 3 different species. All it tells you is that you've got a wireworm if you can find them, but it also can give you a false negative as well. But at least it's something, right? And it's something that's cheap. The sophistication of this trap is not nearly as what Bob was showing you when it comes to research. You wouldn't use this in a research program. But it's something that we can easily do and growers can have. And after you're done with the oatmeal, if you haven't used it all up, it's still usable, right? You can feed it to the kids or whatever. So it's not something that you waste. It was interesting when I did this particular grower, we did his canola fields first, and then we started talking, and he says, well, I got peas over here, and I've got canola over here, and I've got all these different fields. And he says, some years I get lots of damage, some years I don't get any. And it was interesting because when I walked his fields, I could see in the distance already, just walking across the field, where the weeds were. And if you take a look at this picture here, not only is there no crop, but it's loaded with Russian thistle and kochia. So I knew right away, just put a bait ball there. You don't need to have any kind of, it's not a genius thing to do because they all were sprayed, but what's happened is after they did the post-emergent herbicide, you get second flushes. And if you don't get that canopy closure, you're going to have continual weed problems. And of course, that's another whole issue that wireworms could potentially do for us in the West is this whole weed management is serious because we also have some resistance showing up. And if you start losing crops and then you start losing that crop competition, there's been some great work done at Lacombe Research Station with Dr. Harker and Bob Blackshaw at Lethbridge, where they looked at competition and weed control and herbicide performance and then managing resistance. And one of the key strategies is crop competition in terms of managing weed resistance. So that's another area that we need to really look at. So when I pulled this bait ball up, I showed it to the grower, and I says, you got wireworms for sure. I mean, there was close to 18 to 25 in this particular field. So it was no question that he needed to treat. When you talk to many of the growers that we have that are starting to use seed-applied insecticides, there's a gap about 15 to 20 years where there was no seed-applied insecticides used on cereals. It was just a fungicide. But if you talk to the dad that sits at the table, he will tell you stories when every 4 years, he would use an insecticide. Of course, I wanted to know what he was using. Of course, he can't remember. It was dusty, it was dirty, he didn't like it. And of course, based on what we know, it was probably an organochlorine, and he was using it every 4 years. So, but they were managing their population, so it took many, many years. So these problems didn't occur in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. I'm convinced that it took at least 20 years in some fields And I know that for a fact because my brother-in-law farms in Manitoba, and he's put in 33 crops, and we just found wireworms last year. And so it's just starting to be a problem on his farm as well. And so far, the seed treatment technology we have now is working really well, so he's getting good stands right at the present time. This was an interesting one because what we were trying to understand was, do crop rotations make a difference? So this is a 160-acre field, and what we have noticed in the past is it seems like peas seem to be a better crop under high wireworm pressure. So if you look at the field there, the one on the green on the left there is peas, and on the right is barley. And so this is 4 weeks after planting, so we planted the peas and the barley at the same time, and it completely wiped out the barley. But the difference between is seed size. If you look at peas, the 1,000 kernel weight is much bigger than a barley seed. And when you're looking at rates of seed treatment, TKW can make a difference. So the larger the seed, the more you're going to have on there, because we don't plant our crops based on a seed per acre. I mean, we talk about targeting plant populations, but when it comes to treating, we base on volume. So the larger the seed, the more volume you have. And we do know that as the higher the dose on some of these products, the longer the control. So the wireworm comes up, if it's a really low dose, they may take 2 or 3 plants and then they'll stop. But the higher the rate, they'll probably stop feeding at the first seedling. And we've seen that over and over again when we look at our stand counts, that the higher dose rates, that we're getting better stands. And that certainly is part of it. And that's another key thing about the rates. The one thing we don't know is if we put a pea crop in there, is it going to be attractive to the clicks to lay their eggs? And so I posed that to Dr. Vernon, and we're not sure, I guess is the question. But that's another strategy. If we can grow crops that aren't attractive for the clicks to lay their eggs, that might be another way of trying to manage the populations. I just wanted to conclude with this slide because we did a replant, and we were successful. We grow a barley crop. But the key thing here is it's only half the yield of what it should be. So if you look at your input cost, your fertilizer, it's all the same, right? So he was able to break even, but he didn't really make a lot of money on this barley field. The other thing I want to just talk briefly about, in the past when we launched our first seed treatments was back in 1998. At that time, the way we used to apply seed treatments, especially in cereals, was just through an auger. And I remember one grower, when I brought him a jug, just took the jug and just poured it into the auger, and as long as there was some red on there, it was fine. So, but if you're taking a look at wireworm control, there's 2 components that's very important, and that's the application itself. And there's 2 components to application. One is the rate, and I could say that the majority of our growers are very good at putting it. So if a jug says 113 bushels to treat this jug, they're at 113 bushels. The challenge that some of our growers have had in the past is to get that good seed-to-seed coverage. You look at a sample, and some growers say, well, my seed treatment didn't work. And, it's hard to say to him, well, what rate did you put on? And he'll tell me all the rates, and it's all good. But then when I ask if I can see a sample, in those early days when we were just launching seed treatments, I would look at some samples, and I would say 30% of it was treated and 70% was not treated. And those really, really red kernels, they were well treated for sure. But if you take a look at wireworms, it's so important that if you're going to have a seed treatment strategy, that your application is good. So if you look at that bottom picture there, that is becoming more of a common thing. That's a US seed treater. And the quality of treating has improved dramatically. And that comes with the product stewardship part of applying seed treatments too. There has to be a significant product stewardship that goes with it. And as a product that we're selling, liability is also always a big concern. And so what we've found by the application and the quality of treating has really helped us when it comes to expectations and setting expectations with growers. So I just wanted to show that picture because this other one here, I was working with this farmer. He's just north of Swift Current at Abbey, Saskatchewan, and he never really treated. And what he had there was very not great equipment. And since he's upgraded, we can see the performance that we saw 3 years ago in his field with high wireworms is that he got good in-season protection with a seed treatment. So I just want to emphasize that the application component of any seed treatment is also a critical part of your management strategy. So what are some other things that we can do? Well, the one is clearly if we can get a good seed to soil contact. As we have moved to soil conservation, it's amazing how many acres we can do in a week. If you hear on the prairies a crop report saying, oh, it's really wet and it's getting late, in 1 week or 3 weeks, we plant 30 million acres. And it's just amazing because we don't do any seedbed preparation. We just seed right into the thing. The challenge that I always find, though, with growers is that when they start getting late and they're getting behind and they've got a variety they've already bought and it's got so many maturity days, they're thinking of frost damage already in August. So what they'll do is in their mind, I know it, when they're thinking at the supper table, they're thinking, I'm going to go 2 miles an hour faster and I'll get another 10 acre or 20 acres done in an hour. Because right now we can plant with some of these drills 40 acres an hour, and a lot of growers have 2 planters, so we can do 80 acres in an hour. And we can do, and you can just see the calculations going. If a guy's got 10,000 acres, I could be done. And the problem is if you go too fast, you don't get that good seed to soil contact, and then you don't get that good stand. So now you've got already lost, let's say, 10% of your stand just because you didn't properly seed it, and more damage in terms of wireworm. So it's sort of like the little things. It's, when you look at some of these growers who are doing really well, there's no one thing I can tell you that, hey, this is the answer. It's all these little things. The other one component for wireworms particularly is some of our drills now are getting really much better, but in the initial air drills or air seeders that came out on a cultivator, there was quite a bit of variability in depth of seeding. And I remember looking at some of these fields where if you seed to 3 inches, that plant, if there's wireworms there, it's probably not going to make it. If it's seeded at that 1 inch, which is the optimum for cereals for us and spring cereals, that plant will probably still be affected, but at least it'll make it through that season, especially if you can plant a bit later and you get those warm soils and you can get that plant going. There certainly will be feeding, but under low, moderate pressures, you're not going to see a plant loss. But if you seed deep, so it's another simple thing, but shallow seeding is another key strategy. And the reason why we can do that today is soil conservation. If you look at how much tillage from when I did in 1969 to 75 on the farm, I was on that tractor all day, all summer. And by next spring, if we didn't get those early rains or got poor snow, there was no moisture. So we'd plant 3 inches deep to moisture because we didn't know if it was going to rain. So those days are all over. So there's no excuse anymore now with the planters we have and the soil conservation. We can plant at the right soil depth. It's a very simple thing. It's nothing super magic, but it can make a difference. The other last thing I'd like to say is that, high quality seed is important. And you might say, well, that's obvious. But in the prairies, most of our acres are still farm saved when it comes to cereals. So the grower uses his own seed, and that's fine. But now the onus is up to the grower to make sure that that seed is good quality. And 20 years ago, and I remember this very clearly, I would go into a farm and we'd go into the kitchen and I'd see the paper towels with the seed on the fridge. And of course, if you know anything about germination tests, you need to do it at 7 days and you need to do temperature and light and everything else is important. Well, most of those growers would see that, oh, there's a sprout there, it's good. And then they would target their whole plant population based on what that germination test showed them on the fridge. And that's okay, but you know what? When you've got wireworms, you need to know, is there frost damage or is there overheating in the bin? Because if you put an overheated seed into the ground, it's got very poor vigor. It'll germinate, but your vigor is very poor. And when you're looking at wireworms, you got to have a robust plant to survive that initial feeding. If it's got very poor vigor, it's probably not going to survive. So, and the other component to it is if you're looking at putting a seed treatment on it, if you only have 80% germ, that means 20% your treating isn't really doing anything, right? So high germ is a very important part of the strategy so that you can make every dollar count that you put into the crop. So this is my last slide here, and I just wanted to review a little bit. I hope you have a little bit of different appreciation of the prairies and the fact that PI is the only province in Canada that's got wireworms and are struggling, just come and visit me and I'll take you to some farms and you can talk to those growers and see how they're dealing with wireworms. It's not epidemic yet. We are still managing quite successfully, but we are starting to see more and more farms having problems. But the thing is, when Bob was talking about the survey we did, we found wireworms in areas where they told us there's no wireworms. So they're starting. And in those, we're starting to see pockets now where we're seeing significant reduction in stands. So it's starting. But wireworms is a long season pest. It's a worm that stays in the soil for 5 years. So it takes time. But once it gets established, it can really explode. So that's where we are on the majority of farms. But we now have farms where we have serious problems. So the long-term strategy has to be, we have to keep these wireworms in check, the larvae in check. And, I heard this thing about spraying clicks and stuff. I mean, that's the start. We need to keep these wireworms in check if we're going to be able to. And that doesn't mean that we kill every wireworm. That's not the goal at all. But if we can keep them down to a moderate level, to low, this problem is just like any other problem we face on the farm, and we can manage it. So with that, I'd like to close, and I just want to say one last thing. Whatever strategy we come up with in terms of a chemical, it's really critical that it's going to be sustainable, acceptable environmentally, and sociable. We have responsibilities in that area too. And so some of the strategies, we're taking into account those factors as well, because we want something that's doable. I heard one grower says, let's fumigate. Well, that's, to me, unacceptable to fumigate 60 million acres of crop in Western Canada. It's not the answer. But we need to do it responsible. So that's the other part of the equation that we always got to keep in mind. Okay. 45 minutes, I think that's what I had.
Does anybody have any questions for Ted? Brian will likely go around with the microphone. Hand up if you have any questions.
Nobody has a question. Could you comment, please, on soybeans? You talked about canola as the oil seed, the significant acreage here of soybeans and PEI. Could you comment on whether wireworm likes that or dislikes that compared to cereal crops, for example?
We don't have a really good answer for that, to be honest with you. I can only speak for the West, and soybeans is just emerging as an important crop. We're up to about 1 million acres of soybeans now in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So it's for the West anyway, it's a little bit too early for us to know. So I really don't know.
Okay, Ted, I have one question there. Just wondering on the seed treatments there on the cereals and the corn seeds and that, there's different rates of application. Is that correct or incorrect?
That's on the cereals, that's correct.
Okay, in our situation here, where would you put dire severity, from what you've heard, where growers should be, what rate they should be applying?
Yeah, they need to go with the high rates on all seed treatments. No question. That lower rate is a suppression rate on most products, and it's not with the pressures that I've heard today. No, you need to go with a high rate.
Ted, is this a question that you can answer on? And it appears to me as a producer here that the pesticides that we've been using has mostly been repellents when it comes to insecticide type of approach. Is the science changing, or is it possible? I mean, to have more of a products that'll kill the pest and not let our numbers get so high? Is that a trend that the research is going to, or where are we in that?
Yeah. I'm not going to steal Bob's thunder, so I won't ask you which insecticides. He's going to share with that later. But the one thing that's very different today is if you look at, and I can only speak for Dr. Vernon because I only know his work, but he actually screens the behavior of the insecticides to the wireworm. So we do that in the lab in some of the window studies, and we can tell right away whether the insecticide is a repellent or if it's going to be potential not a repellent. And that's a thing that we never used to do in the past. If you look at the early work, we didn't really understand how the wireworms were really behaving when they came in contact with the insecticide. So now when we know that, we can develop a strategy. So if it is a repellent, for example, that could mean a very different look in terms of how we use that product versus it's something that we can actually kill. I'll let Bob answer that question after lunch.
So Bob's going to answer the question on the insecticide that you showed in your trials there?
He'll show some data. On those particular trials, we looked at 4 different modes of action, and some are repellent, some are intoxicating, some cause mortality. But we also now know we've got some other chemistries that also have mortality. And the question that we have to address is what is going to be the rate? Because if you take an insecticide that you have high mortality, it may not give you the stand protection that you need. Because we're finding that some of these, you can go to such low rates that you look at the plots and you'll say, well, it's not working very well. But that's immaterial. So when you look at some of the work that's been done, looking at mixture strategies and so on, the key is that we're trying to go at very low rates to control a problem that we don't need a lot of chemical, actually. But it has to be in balance with the stand. So mixture strategies and all these are now a big part of it as well in terms of the strategy for wireworm control.
I don't know if you can talk about your company, but where do you find wireworm as a priority for finding a solution? Like I've talked to a number of companies and it's not always high on the radar list. Can you make any comments on that? Because for us here, in whether we're in a different situation, it's a very high priority. Can you make any comments on where Syngenta stands on?
Yeah, 10 years ago, when I went to our global office, they didn't even talk about wireworms. Now it's considered the number one. It's actually ranked very close to corn rootworm now, because we're experiencing problems in France, Greece, and other countries, and of course our headquarters is in Europe. So if it happens there first, it's always a good thing. But we are seeing that it's a much higher priority, and we're looking at some new insecticides, and we're going to be screening them this year. And the thing is, investing in wireworm research is a lot more. Like if I look at a wireworm research program, it's almost 10x to doing a herbicide program or research. It's just because there's so much labor involved. It's not just a one-year shot. You can say, oh, well, this works. It takes 2 to 3 years to really understand it. And then, of course, once you've got that dose, then you got to think about the application. Like, how can you easily get it on the seed for the farmer, right? So there's that whole formulation concepts, and will it go through a planter? It has to be low dust off. I mean, all these factors that also have to be involved, so it takes more time.
If there's no more questions, Leslie Wright's here from Gage Agro. As we know, Thymid is due to has been extended now for I think 3 times. So we have to keep that in consideration just due to constraints in the supply chain and whatnot. So I've asked Leslie to make a couple of comments on the Thymid situation. Either talk there or come up to the front or wherever you like to talk. Okay.
I just want to give a quick update on Thymid, but I want to start a little bit with a history. The reevaluation was done in the late 90s, early 2000, with a decision made in 2002. And I think at that time, wireworms, with the exception of potatoes, wasn't as high a priority as it is today. And the PMRA made a decision just to continue with 4-8 or Thymid use in potatoes. And now it's becoming a bigger issue in other crops, and it's continuing to be a big issue in potatoes. The key issue the PMRA has at this time with Thymid is small birds and small mammals, mainly due to the bird kills that occurred in the 90s in the US and in Canada. I'd like to mention that since there's been changes to the label in the early 2000s, there has been no bird kills at this time reported in the US or Canada with the use of 4-8 or Thymid. Since this has become a more important issue and wireworms continue to be an increasing problem for growers, AMVAC is looking at different mitigation measures to be able to address the small bird and small mammal issue, and they've come up with a few ideas they'd like to move forward with. I wanted to mention that ThyMet is still registered in the US and still registered in other areas of the world. It's just not, it's set for phase out in Canada. The phase out is going to be started at the end of this year, with last date of sale of December 31st by AMVAC to the supply chain. Last date of sale is going to be May 1st from retailers to the growers of 2015, and the last date of use will be August of 2015. In their decision in 2012, they did put a provision in there that there could be an extension of an additional 2 years if an application for registration of control or suppression of wireworm has been received by the PMRA. I spoke to Terry Contner last week at the PMRA, and he's indicated that that condition has not been met at this time at the PMRA. So the PMRA has indicated that they are moving forward with the phase-out period. The transition strategy for control of wireworm in potatoes is a group that has been meeting annually or twice a year. They are going to be meeting at the end of this month to discuss the research that's been done. There was a cluster that was put together nationally that was set to identify different methods, different things that you could use to control wireworm. And that data is going to be presented to the group in February. The one thing that Engage would recommend to growers who still rely on ThyMet for control of wireworm in their fields for potatoes is potentially to set up a meeting with PMRA to discuss the future of 4-8 if they're open to that, to identify the key concerns. I do know that birds are the key concern. We have brought to their attention that there has been no bird kills since the mitigation measures have been put in place in 2002. However, the PMRA has indicated that they are still concerned that the birds and small mammals are an issue with the application of ThyMet. I think that it needs to be presented to PMRA the growth of the wireworm issues, and that ThyMet is still, at this time, my understanding is the only control option that is working the best for you. I know there's lots of control options available, but I understand that ThyMet is still the most effective for you guys. And then I also think it'll be important to present to them the work that the cluster is doing to indicate that growers and researchers are working very hard to identify a solution for this wireworm problem. That's the update I have for you guys. Any questions?
Could you please repeat it? And I wasn't sure I understood. Did you say that they would consider an extension past 2015 if there was an application for, I just didn't quite understand that part.
Okay, so I looked it up and I have the exact wording on the directive. There will be an extension will be granted for an additional 2 years if an application for registration of an alternate product is received by the agency. That's the wording that they have used.
So you mean an extension past
2015, so it would be able to carry forward till 2017.
So is there not an alternate product hoping to receive registration this spring? Like
my understanding is that that is correct. However, when I spoke with Terry, he indicated that condition has not been met. So because, like my understanding, so I'm not the registrant of that active ingredient, so I don't know what the status is on that particular product, but I understood that there was one, so I was surprised when Terry had indicated that condition has not been met. Okay. So that might be a question for FMC.
And it's just because I don't know if we've sent, I know through our industry organization at the national level, we have been talking with them about, you know, applying to or not applying because we can't apply, but asking PMRA about the possibility of extension given the situation. And so but that's sort of in process right now. And I know there's a meeting of the 4-8 transition strategy coming up in the next week or so.
Yeah, I think that you would have to ask FMC that, because I don't have that information. My understanding was there was something in at the agency. So I was surprised when Terry had indicated that.
Any more questions for Leslie Wright from Engage Agro? Once again, thanks. Leslie came down from Ontario just to be here, representing Engage Agro, which distributes, and AMBAC, which is the manufacturer of Thiamid. It just so happens we do have a representative here from FMC, Mark McMillan, and he is right over here. So I asked Mark as well to make a few comments on a possible new product that they have coming down the pipeline.
My name is Mark McMillan. I'm with FMC, and I'll give you an update on our product, which is Capture Bifenthrin. PMRA have had the product for several years, and the indication that we have is that they told us at the end of last year that the registration will come through the end of May. On hearing that, we initiated you can call it a campaign, where we got a lot of support from industry, the different potato growers organizations across Canada, to indicate to PMRA that we would require or need to have that approval before then, so we're in time for the planting season. At the same time, we wanted to make an application for field trial permits so we could get product into the field, and we've actually made that request twice, and both times they've indicated to us not to go that route because they couldn't promise anything, but they thought there wouldn't be a need for them. So on that, what we have done is we've already allocated some product to bring into Canada. Bifenthrin is a product already registered and used in the US, and we anticipate to have enough product to treat about 5,000 acres this coming season. We understand the problem is here in PI, however, we anticipate testing field trial work with it in other parts of Canada, in Ontario and the West. But I would assume that most of the product will come this direction, and we're looking forward to the opportunity where hopefully it won't be too late for some growers to get it into the field here and determine the performance of Capture Bifenthrin. As you may already know, that the product has been well researched over a number of years by Ag Canada, including Christine has done a lot of work here in PI, I think for the last 4 years, and the indications show that it will perform as well as the current product Thiamid. That's all, unfortunately, I can tell you. I wish I could be telling you that the product has been approved and that a lot more product will be available. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm sure, I think there'll be some more information just on insecticide work this afternoon with the research from Bob and Christine and Zenaida and as well Joanne. So just for one, we did invite PMRA to come down from Ottawa. I was on the talking with them for the last number of weeks. They did refuse to come down. We wanted the registration folks here. There's some local PMRA people here, but we wanted the registration folks here just so they could see the crowd, meet the growers, just get a better handle on the situation. Anyways, they wouldn't come down. So we did invite them to come down though, and tried to work with them to come down, but just couldn't happen. So anyways, I'll turn it back over to Chair Ryan.